So this is just to welcome everyone on behalf of Colnaghi and the Colnaghi Foundation. This kind of activities, the symposium, is very important to us and to the mission of CF, which, as you know, relates to the preservation of all master knowledge and the transmission to the current and the next generation. CF has, over the past couple of years, created its vision in order to situate it over three main pillars: scholarship promotion, technology for heritage, and partnerships. So I'm very glad to take the opportunity today to announce two very important partnerships that we have just signed off. One is with the Vatican. Its impact will become more aware to everyone over the next couple of months, but I'm very glad to announce it on this occasion, and with the Royal Commission of Alula for a series of streams of partnerships that Colnaghi Foundation is establishing in Saudi. But of course, a scholarship being so fundamental for the vision, for the mission of the Colnaghi Foundation, it is the Colnaghi Study Journal, once again, that make us beyond proud. Thanks to the wonderful editor of the Colnaghi Study Journal, to Irene, to Nicola, to Professor Jeremy Howard, we managed in the past to establish an extremely elegant, with a wonderful flair and academic rigorous publication. But it is, once again, just thanks to you, to all the scholars, the researchers, to the passion that you put in your work, in your academic work, that we are able to produce such an academic and wonderful academic journal. So it is really with a big heart that I welcome you here. I hope that you enjoy the day. I'm very sorry that I could not be physically in London, but the Biennale in Florence has just started. And I wish a wonderful continuation of the day. Leaving the stage now to Nicola.
Welcome everybody from me too. I am Nicola Jennings. I'm the director of the Athena Art Foundation. I used to work here at Colnaghi, at the Colnaghi Foundation. But when I left and my colleague Irene Brooke left Colnaghi and we set up the Athena Art Foundation, which is about 3 years ago, we committed to keep editing the Colnaghi Studies Journal. The journal has a fantastic editorial committee, which reviews all the submissions. We publish it twice a year, in case any of you haven't come across it. You can find the latest issue on the Colnaghi Foundation website. You can also find it on the Athena Art Foundation website under the To Read section. It's a very beautifully produced journal. Jorge Cole, CEO of Colnaghi, insisted when we set the journal up that it should look great and that the quality of the paper should be fantastic, the quality of the images should be fantastic. They have quite a big mailing list. You can look at it, I think, through academia.edu. Libraries around the world get it. So it gets quite a wide distribution. The reason that we wanted to organize this symposium is because we are going to dedicate the March issue of the journal to Viceregal art in Latin America and Brazil. So just to tell you a little bit about Athena. Athena is a digital-only arts education charity. We have a website with listings of exhibitions about pre-20th century art, because that's our focus around the world. We have a YouTube page with nearly 100 podcasts, talks, and short videos. We have an Instagram account, and we even have a TikTok account now. So let's start, shall we? Helena Santidrián is our first speaker. Helena has recently completed an MA at the Courtauld Institute of Art, studying under the supervision of Professor Susie Nash, who was my PhD supervisor, and Tom Dixon, known to many of us here. Helena holds a graduate diploma from the same institution and Cultural Heritage BA from the University of Milan.
Hello, everyone. As Nicola just said, I'm Helena Santidrián. I've just finished my MA at the Courtauld. Thank you so much, Nicola, for organizing this, and thank you, Candida. I don't know if she's still watching, for hosting us. What I'm going to present is still work in progress. Working on it. I've been working on it for a while, but it's not very easy to access the piece that I'm going to be presenting because it's in a regional museum in Spain. I apologize for the quality of some of the images as well. They're the images coming directly from the museum, but they're not great quality. I'm gonna talk about this piece. It's a chiseled silver statuette. It's about 26 centimeters tall, so it's not very big. It was probably produced in Peru, in the Cusco school, in the mid-19th century, in the years following the War of Independence, years of turmoil in Peru. I'm gonna start talking a bit about St. James's, who is the subject represented in the statuette. And then I'm going to explain how this apostle is represented in the peninsula, usually as the so-called Santiago Matamoros, and how this iconography is then developed in the Viceregal territories and with the expansion of the Spanish kingdom in Central and South America, and how this applies to Mary Louise Pratt's concept of the contact zones developed in 1991 in her brilliant article, and what meaning this statuette has in that historical context. St. James died in the Holy Land, but in order to explain why his body is now buried in the northwest of the peninsula in Santiago de Compostela, a legend developed that said that his body was literally taken on a boat to the peninsula in what is called the Traslatio Santiago. And here is the Traslatio, it's depicted here. This is again in the same museum, in the Museum of Pilgrimage in which the statuette is. Apologies for the quality of the image because it's terrible, but you can see it there. The body is nowadays in Santiago de Compostela, which is the city that has his name. Santiago, St. James, Santiago, Jacob is the same name. The legend says that in the 9th century, a man saw some lights in the sky pointing towards a specific point in a field, and then he alerted. He thought it was a divine miracle, so he alerted the bishop of the place, who was called Teodomiro, and Teodomiro then founded the church, which is nowadays, it used to be the Diocese of Iria Flavia, and is nowadays the Diocese of Santiago. So it's supposed to be the place, according to a legend, of course, where the body of the apostle was found. The iconography of the Santiago Matamoros, which is one of the most common ones in the Iberian Peninsula, it generates from this specific episode, which is when St. James, Santiago was supposed to have appeared and interceded during the Battle of Clavijo, which is one of the most important battles of the reconquest of Spain, which started in just after 711, when 711, when the Muslim conquest began, and then the Christian kingdoms reacted to the conquest. The Battle of Clavijo was in 1844, and there was this mythic and legendary moment in which St. James appeared and interceded to help the Christian kingdoms and kill the Moors. That's what the legend says. That from that killing the Moors or Moor Slayer is the situation from which the iconography Matamoros, which means literally Moor Slayer, is born. This has an incredible distribution throughout the whole peninsula, especially in Santiago, in really important places, in really important churches, among which the baldachin of the Cathedral of Santiago, which has on top St. James Matamoros, Santiago Matamoros, in a very explicit sculpture. This is at the top of the organ of the Cathedral of Santiago as well. And this is in one of the chapels. This was removed in 2021, and the chapel was then dedicated to the Bishop Teodomiro, who was the one who found was supposed to have found the tomb of the apostle. So it's an iconography, of course, that has had a lot of politically correct interventions due to its nature of being called, as it is, Santiago Matamoros, the Moor Slayer. The figure of Santiago Matamoros has been used throughout the history of Spain, especially during fascism, as a myth of patriotism, Spanish patriotism, and as a way of bringing to the present the crusade against the others in an Edwardside meaning. So in the past years, it's been used to advocate for a unity or a far right unity of Spain against the arrival of immigrants. this has been happening since the 40s, since the first years of Franco's dictatorship. In fact, during those years, the name Santiago Matamoros was even changed to Santiago Matarrojos, which means Santiago, the one who kills the communists, because rojos is used for communists. So the iconography and the meaning of the iconography has been changing so much over the past centuries, for always in a process of othering and going against someone foreign and expressing this sense of unity and making Santiago appear as a myth, and he's even called Caballero sometimes. He became the patron. He's supposed to be the patron saint of Spain. So he had a very important and nowadays, as I was saying, far right nuance that is particularly important for the way in which I'm going to talk about the silver statuette. It is nowadays, as I was saying, in very important places. This is the top of the city hall's facade in Santiago. Inside the symphony, you can see the Battle of Clavijo, which is where he interceded, and on top is Santiago Matamoros. So even though they removed it from one of the chapels, he still is on top of the city hall's facade. It can be found around the whole peninsula. This is I've just put one of the examples. This is in Valladolid, but it can truly be found in any kind of visual or cultural work, decorative arts, chapels, manuscripts, paintings, anything. In almost every church of Spain, there is some piece that contains this iconography. I've covered the political party for obvious reasons, but this is a piece of political propaganda from 3 years ago, where you can see a figure that echoes that of Santiago Matamoros and says Spain is Christian, not Muslim. And this is just 3 years ago, which is scary. With the arrival of the Spanish, we cannot talk about Spain yet, but of the Spanish Empire at the end of the 15th century, these iconographies exported to America. And it's then turned from Matamoros, the Moor slayer, to Mataindios, the Indian slayer. So the process of othering is completely changed and readapted to a new territory. In fact, Mary Louise Pratt, as I was saying, uses and mentions this in her brilliant Context Zones essay, to mentioning Felipe Guamán Poma de Ayala, who was an, if I may say, Indian, using the terminology of the moment, who converted to Christianity and who adopted this iconography and made it, and he almost identifies with Santiago Matamoros, with Santiago Mataindios here, Matamoros that then becomes Mataindios. In fact, the chronicle in which he added this iconography is the Chronicle of the Good Government, which is interesting and shocking if we're talking about a person who had just converted to Christianity. Just to give you an idea of what Mary Louise Pratt calls contact zones, they are social spaces where cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism, slavery, or their aftermath, as they are lived out in many parts of the world today. So I believe this iconography, both Santiago Matamoros, Santiago Mataindios, and as we will see later with this particular statuette, Santiago Mataespañoles, as it will be changed, and also Santiago Matarrojos, is particularly inherent to this concept by Pratt, of these contact zones in which there is turmoil and there are cultures meeting each other and she says grapple with each other, which is, I think, is particularly interesting. This is another example of another Mataindios, which is already colonial school. So we're seeing that this iconography is accepted almost by the colonial schools. But then in the years of the Peruvian independence, pieces like artworks like these start appearing, in which, in this case, the Inca population tries to look for their own myth and their own inheritance and their own culture, bringing back objects that, like creating objects such as these that is supposed to be, this is currently in a private collection, it's by an antiquarian, is owned by an antiquarian. You can see the name there, who is one of the leading Viceregal art dealers. And he believes this is painted by a descendant of Inca nobility, who painted this in some way to reivindicate the rights of the population to stay in that territory and to be in that territory, because it had been there for centuries. So they bring back a series of the kings of Peru, and in a way of they're making a statement, a point of how for generations they've been the kings of the territory. And this is a very similar process to the one that we can see here. Now, I think this was probably destined for a higher social class person who belonged to probably the local population, who wanted to make a point. So then the iconography that we've seen translated from Matamoros to Mataindios, now we see it as Mataespañoles. So it's how their own, the iconography of oppression is turned against the colonizers, which I think it's particularly interesting. As I said at the beginning, this is still work in progress, so I would love to hear what you think about it. I'm in contact with the museum, and I still have to visit them again and share my ideas again with the curators. But I just wanted to share this here because I think it would be a great moment to have more ideas and to hear what you think about it. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Helena. That was fascinating. Our next speaker is Dr. Ana Maria Tavares, who is Associate Professor of Art History at Fine Arts School, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Anna has come all the way from Brazil, which is just extraordinary. She has an MA and PhD in art history from the University of Paris, Sorbonne, where she completed postdoctoral research, also at the Institut National de l'Histoire d'Art, and she curates exhibitions on Brazilian art. Her research focuses on relations between Brazil and Europe, especially during the 19th centuries.
I will talk about a Brazilian artist from the 19th century and a specific painting. So I will read because my English is not so good, so it's better to read. It's curious how one research leads to another. The path of investigation often surprises us. Who would have thought a pandemic would end up leading me to solve the mystery of a missing painting by the 19th century Brazilian artist Antônio Firmino Monteiro? The first time I became interested in Monteiro was during my research on Impressionism in Brazil between 2018 and 2020. His name appeared in Rio de Janeiro newspapers during the 1880s, and his painting was associated with Impressionism. Shortly after, in early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic locked us inside our homes. In the time before the university adopted online classes, I decided to create videos about my academic subjects and post them on YouTube. That's how I recorded a video about Monteiro, which I posted on my channel on July 20, 2020. Because of this video, 3 years later, Tatiana Gravina reached out to me. Living in Curitiba, over 400 miles from Rio, Tatiana sent me messages on WhatsApp. She was excited and eager to tell me about a painting she had recently inherited from her grandfather. Upon checking the signature, she searched the internet and found my video about Monteiro. That's how she got in touch with me. Later in this talk, I will return to Tatiana and the painting she inherited. For now, it's important to explain who Monteiro was and share what we know about this particular painting entitled Major Vidigal. Antônio Firmino Monteiro was a very active painter in Rio de Janeiro at the end of the 19th century, who charmed his contemporaries and left his mark in the local newspapers that covered his exhibitions, considering him both a bold and dedicated artist. 5 years ago, I knew almost nothing about him. While seeking more information about the artist in academic works, books, and exhibition catalogs, I learned that Monteiro was one of the few Black painters of the 19th century. It is well known that since colonial times, there have been Black artists in Brazil. The Imperial Academy of Fine Arts in Rio de Janeiro, founded in 1816, had Black art students. They can be seen in photographs now held in the archives of the School of Fine Arts at UFRJ. However, it's not always possible to identify them by their names. The most prominent Black artist of Monteiro's generation was Estevão Silva, a renowned still life painter. Other well-known Black artists, such as the brothers João Timóteo da Costa and Arthur Timóteo da Costa, had successful careers in the early 20th century. The centennial of Brazil's abolition of slavery in 1988 sparked renewed interest in the history of Black artists. A key example is the seminal publication, Black Painters of the 1800s, organized by Emanuel Araújo, a Black artist who later founded the Afro-Brazil Museum in São Paulo. Our study on Monteiro is part of the effort to recover stories that have been forgotten. What did Monteiro look like? He was very elegant and always well-dressed. That's how he appears in a portrait that belongs to the National Museum of Fine Arts. Standing with his arms crossed over his chest, he is firm and proud. His body is slightly turned to the right, while his face angles to the left, creating a dynamic twist. His dreamy gaze is directed beyond the frame. This portrait, an oil painting on porcelain, signed by Emma Burru, an artist of great sensitivity, captures Monteiro's determination. His dedication and work ethic were consistently praised by his contemporaries throughout his life. The number of articles and notes about Monteiro in the final decade of his life is impressive and shows the recognition he achieved. His exhibitions were often featured in local newspapers, which frequently praised his work. Despite this attention, Monteiro was mostly forgotten in the 20th century. Reading the 19th century news, I was particularly surprised by learning of the painter's closeness to Emperor Dom Pedro II, who always visited his exhibitions, and Princess Isabel, who supported him in his endeavors. Monteiro studied at the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts in Rio de Janeiro, where one of his teachers was the renowned painter Vitor Meireles de Lima. Throughout his brief career, Monteiro, who died at the age of 33, experimented widely, painting still lifes, landscapes, history paintings, and genre paintings. He sometimes merged genre painting with history painting, as in Major Vidigal. When Monteiro exhibited Major Vidigal at the Fine Arts Salon in Rio de Janeiro in 1884, it made a lasting impression. He chose to paint a historical scene set in colonial times, but instead of illustrating heroic actions, he painted militiamen in uniform harassing a humble musician. His Brazilian contemporaries were pleased with this novelty. Monteiro painted Major Vidigal in Paris, where he went to perfect his painting skills and keep up with the artistic innovations of Europe. In that same salon, Monteiro exhibited 27 paintings, covering a wide range of subjects. A critic commented to his numerous paintings in the magazine A Estação. There are many works, but none of them are good. You know that Mr. Firmino Monteiro is the author of the well-known painting, The Founding of the City of Rio de Janeiro, which is indeed beautiful. After completing this work, Mr. Firmino Monteiro left for Europe, and I believe he visited the most famous museums. This visit awakened in him what we call the vertigo of the masters. Our artist became perplexed and indecisive about the path he should follow, and perhaps this explains the variety of works presented here. After his general overview and analysis of the artist's works, the critic turns his attention to particular pieces. It included a detailed comment on Major Vidigal. Major Vidigal, a small painting depicting colonial customs, is well executed and delightful. The lattice door, the red curtain, the ditch, the crossing plank, they were all painted with great care. Except perhaps for the figure of the street musician, who could have been portrayed in a manner more typical of Rio de Janeiro, there is nothing in this work by Mr. Firmino Monteiro that does not deserve praise. It's only natural that if the artist persists in this genre, so rarely explored among us, he will easily attain the rank of master, to which his talent and hard work entitle him. The only thing the reviewer didn't like was the way the guitarist was drawn. He was not portrayed as typically carioca, a native of Rio de Janeiro. This note appears in other articles about the painting, and the offending detail is a headscarf on the musician's head. Some associated this detail with Spanish customs. Regarding this headscarf, Felix Ferreira wrote, disagreeing with these critics. One of the most respected publications of our press mistakenly noted the lack of appropriateness in the attire of the singer, finding that the cape he wears and the headscarf on his head are not part of our customs, but rather of the Spaniards. This fashion was very prevalent among the lower classes in the past century and the beginning of this one, and it is still not uncommon to find it in use in the provinces of the interior. The whole debate about the headscarf in the figure is quite interesting. It is the first sign that something was missing in the story of the painting. Let me explain. For years, it was assumed that Major Vidigal had only one version on canvas, this one that you are looking at. We are also familiar with a sketch of the painting published in the illustrated catalogue of the exhibition. This sketch fits the description of Major Vidigal with its militiamen facing the viewer, scarf, ditch, and plank described in the 1884 critic reviews, but they didn't match the painting known to us as Major Vidigal. In a 2016 dissertation, Giovanna Lois Moreira already observed several differences between the drawing and the painting. Following Giovanna's observations, we indeed verified that a house is in a completely different position. In the catalog drawing, the house is located on the right and has only one floor, while in the painting, the house is located on the left and has two floors. As for the characters, in the drawing, only the musician has his back to the audience and his face is not given much detail. In the painting, the musician faces the viewers and is surrounded by soldiers with their backs turned to us. The attitude of Major Vidigal is quite expressive in the painting, much more than in the drawing. Therefore, we understood that the painting known as Major Vidigal in the 21st century, which re-emerged to the public when it was auctioned in 2008, was not the same one that had been exhibited in 1884. The logical conclusion was that there might have been two versions of the painting on canvas, and in the middle of the pandemic, this was one of the stories I discussed on YouTube, the missing Major Vidigal. On a visit to the Ricardo Brenan Institute this year, I finally saw this painting in person and was able to photograph the signature area, which clearly shows Rio, 1887. It was not the same painting exhibited in 1884 that we know was painted in Paris in 1883. And who was Major Vidigal? Why did he attract Monteiro? Miguel Nunes Vidigal, better known as Major Vidigal, was a Brazilian military man who became the police commander in 1821. The writer Manuel Antônio de Almeida immortalized him in the novel Memoirs of a Militia Sergeant. Let's see how Almeida describes him in the novel. Major Vidigal was the absolute ruler, the final authority on all matters related to law enforcement. He was both judge and jury, meting out punishments and pursuing criminals. There wasn't a single corner or street in the city where Major Vidigal hadn't tracked down a crook or chased a vagrant. His cunning was legendary, and just the mention of his name was enough to frighten anyone with a guilty conscience. Oops. The scene chosen by Monteiro in his painting shows Major Vidigal and his grenadiers harassing a street musician, whom they consider a vagrant. Monteiro's bold choice was original within 19th century Brazilian painting. Instead of painting a heroic character, Monteiro shows a repressive colonial daily life that sought to suppress popular culture. So let's return to my conversation with Tatiana Gravina, which started in October last year. After seeing my YouTube video, she wondered if her inherited picture could be the earliest version of Major Vidigal. She shared some photos, and when I compared them to the 1884 drawing, the similarities were striking. During our conversation, she asked me to authenticate the artwork through photographs. I explained to her that it would be necessary to see the work in person, and if possible, with a small group of specialists. Finally, after I had reached out to specialists I knew, this group was organized as follows. 3 members of the School of Fine Arts at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Edson Mota, a professor and restorer of artworks, Cláudia Rocha, this one, who in addition to being a PhD student preparing a thesis on Monteiro, is also a museologist at the National Museum of Fine Arts, and I, an art history professor. Maralis Cristo, a history professor, joined us from the Federal University of Juiz de Fora in the state of Minas Gerais. It took a few months before we could organize our trip. On January 29, 2024, we arrived in Curitiba, excited about the possibility of seeing the painting and verifying its authenticity. We had to consider the possibility that it might be a fake, perhaps even produced from the drawing present in the 1884 catalog. At Tatiana's house, we are able to examine the painting carefully and attentively. Removed from the wall, it was possible to examine it in a dark room under ultraviolet lights, paying special attention to the area of the signature to check if it had been added later. Next, taking the painting to the well-lit outdoor area, a comparison was made with another painting, this one, with confirmed authorship by Monteiro. It was a small canvas belonging to Edson Mota, who brought it to Curitiba specifically so that we could compare the 2 paintings. This examination proved to be very important, as it was indeed possible to recognize the artist's technique, color palette, and painting styles. Edson drew our attention to the similar way in which the heads of the characters were constructed. Upon examining the back of the painting, Edson Mota recognized the technique widely used by restorer Carlota Martins dos Santos, who worked in Rio de Janeiro in the 1970s. It involved, after wax relining, covering the back of the stretcher with fabric, thus hiding the typical wax stains that were usually visible on the reverse of the canvas. This technique, which is no longer used, as he explained, was purely for aesthetic purposes, to please the eyes of the owners of the restored paintings. Nevertheless, this intervention served as another evidence confirming the painting's authenticity. The joy of having seen this painting, of having contributed to its preservation, is now added to the desire to continue studying this painting in its two versions. Why did Monteiro return to the theme in 1887? He could have been fulfilling a commission from a collector. However, it is interesting to notice how in the second version, he accentuates the violence of the scene in which the popular musician is cornered by the police. Both paintings open up paths for further research and new discoveries. Thank you for your attention. It was a pleasure to share this research with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was wonderful. How exciting.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Sanya Santidrián.
Yes,
good.
thank you.
Sanya is an art historian specializing in Latin American indigenous societies, art and visual culture, particularly focusing on Mesoamerica and New Spain. She received the Alfonso Casa Medal upon completing her doctorate at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. And her research, she's also had support from the Berlin-based Forum Transregionales Studien and the Kunsthistorische Institute in Florence, Max Planck, where she's held postdoctoral positions. And she's recently also worked as a research associate with the international research group Bildfahrzeuge. Sanya, thank you so much for agreeing to speak today.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm so delighted to share some of my work with you today on Saint Joseph. This paper examines an 18th century feather mosaic of Saint Joseph with the Child from Mexico, exploring its artistry, cultural significance, and role within the broader context of religious devotion in colonial New Spain. The mosaic, which merges indigenous and European techniques, serves as a testament to the artistic innovation of Novo-Hispanic artists. Through detailed analysis, this study sheds light on how this devotional work reflects and contributes to the evolving image of Saint Joseph, particularly in relation to the theological and cultural shifts of the period. You see my hand here in comparison to the feather mosaics, just to see the scale. Saint Joseph with the Child is a small-scale devotional feather mosaic depicting a tender father-son relationship. It reflects the Josephine worship that became prominent in Spanish America since the early colonial period. Created by an unidentified artist from the Viceroyalty of New Spain, Mexico, this artwork is now housed in Berlin Ethnologisches Museum. The museum dates it to the mid-18th century. Originally framed in mirror glass, the frame's characteristics are now lost. Executing using a mosaic technique, the work involves arranging trimmed feathers in layers on a flat, solid surface. This technique, rooted in pre-Hispanic traditions, uses an adhesive called tautle in Nahuatl, derived from orchid bulbs. While the European rectangular format was adopted, the artwork uniquely blends European visual elements with indigenous techniques and materials, resulting in a distinct Novo-Hispanic genre. The 18th century feather paintings saw transformation in material supports, the inclusion of new artistic materials such as oil paint, and a reinvention of the Josephine cult itself, necessitating new images. This piece exemplifies mixed techniques combining feathers of various birds and oil paint on a metal plate to enhance the depiction of the figures, illustrating an evolving image-making process. This devotional feather painting portrays a crowned Joseph standing centrally, protectively enfolding the Christ child within his cloak. Joseph supports Jesus with his right arm while holding a flowering staff in his left, symbolizing his purity and chaste marriage to the Virgin Mary. These attributes, inviting devotees' prayers as the Virgin's worthy spouse and Jesus' putative father, became standard across Catholic regions from the 17th century onward. The figures share loving gazes, with the child clinging affectionately to his stepfather. The addition of oil paint enhances the tender expressions, defining their faces and adding volume to their hands and the infant legs. Joseph, depicted in a yellow and red cloak cover over long-sleeved tunic in shifting green, blue, violet, or brown hues, depending on the angle of observations. And you are seeing two photographs taken from a different angle so that you can see the luminosity, different luminosity of the feathers in the background. Bears garments trimmed with a golden effect or yellow. The long dark lines on Joseph's robe mimic the folds the artist would have seen in printed sources and different paintings. The child, dressed in a white tunic, reaches towards Joseph's face with two white elements near his head, representing a partly visible cruciform halo, signifying his holiness. The scene appears set in a semi-open space, similar to other paintings on this theme. The indoor setting includes a bed made of white feathers, accented by flaming red feathers drapery, with slim white highlights indicating folds and golden effect trimmings. The floor is fashioned from brown and cream-colored feathers. To the left, there is a piece of furniture, likely a table, covered with a cloth made of green and blue feathers. There are multicolored elements on its surface, probably flowers similar to those on Joseph's stuff. Flowers and fruits are often depicted in scenes with the Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph, and Jesus. In this composition, the artist skillfully merges the two-dimensional space typical of Amerindian imagery with a three-dimensional linear perspective of European painting and the atmospheric perspective. This blend of material and iconographic elements achieves a sense of both temporality and timelessness. The foreground, featuring Joseph and the Christ child near furniture made of larger opaque feathers, suggests an intimate, possibly domestic setting. In contrast, the luminous background, highlighted by the whitish clouds in the upper left, indicates the outdoor space, symbolizing heavenly glory and the sacred nature of the father-son relationship. The iridescence of the feathers enhances this sacredness. The Amerindian approach to space allows for multiple perspectives, such as the table depicted in two dimensions, from a bird's eye view and frontally, while the furniture is positioned slightly diagonally, creating an illusion of depth. This effect is further emphasized by using dark feathers to suggest shadows beneath the bed. The artist also constructs an atmospheric perspective through the use of vibrant materials, including hummingbird feathers, known for their unique optical qualities that cause light to shimmer in varying colors. The interplay of light between the viewer and the feathers introduces another dimension to the image, invoking a sense of eternity and the sacred. The light originates from the beholder's space, making them an active participant in interpreting the work. The delicate shimmering texture of the feathers adds to the image's tactile and visual appeal, almost compelling the viewer to touch the mosaic. The intimate scale of the artwork enhances its sense of preciousness, with a delicate material corresponding to the depicted tenderness between father and son. According to colonial sources from central Mexico, such as Book 9 from the Florentine Codex, Diamanteca, or feather artisans, created a variety of feather objects, including warriors' attire, shields, headdresses, and garments for high-ranking individuals and rulers. Feathers were also considered quintessential for making sacred objects. This sacred quality persisted in the creation of Christian images and objects following the arrival of the Spaniards. Alessandra Russo, in her analysis of the feather mosaic of the Mass of Saint Gregory from 1539 argues that the Holy Spirit manifests in the material, with the feather artist creating a relic of the Trinity through tropical plumage, symbolically linking feather, bird, and the Holy Spirit. This interweaving connected worldly and heavenly realms across time. Johannes Neurath further asserts that in Amerindian ritual art, the raw materials themselves give meaning to objects and images, not just their expression. Feathers introduced a novel element to religious art, blending European traditions with indigenous craftsmanship under the guidance of Catholic friars. From the early days of colonization, featherworks adorned newly built churches, serving as a familiar and effective medium for converting native peoples. They were also made for export to Europe and beyond as an attractive new medium and became objects of admiration as curiosities and works of great artistic value. This exotic material, the distinctive sign of America and its peoples, was particularly marveled at because of the brilliance of the feathers and the vividness of their colors. As Rousseau notes, European church officials grew passionate about these feather items from New Spain, which were not only displayed but also worn during liturgical ceremonies. The demand, production, and circulation of these feather artworks were so significant that the 16th century is considered the golden age of feather art in a transcultural context. However, the colonial feather art of the 17th and 18th centuries still warrants greater scholarly attention. In her study on 17th century Mexican devotional feather paintings, Luisa Elena Alcalá notes that despite the abundance of small religious feather mosaics, there is still much we don't know about their production, reception, and devotion. This gap suggests their significance in various contexts as their consumption and visibility diversified. The interaction between materiality and subject matter likely varied among audiences. As Alcalá notes, I quote, "For some extremely devout individuals, perhaps the materiality was subordinate to iconography and the function. For others, there could be even the reciprocity, the mysterious handling of precious materials, reinforcing and complementing the devotional effect instead of detracting from it." End of quote. The common belief is that feather art production in the 18th century declined in both quantity and quality. Francisco Javier Clavijero, in his Historia Antica de México from 1780, observed that, I quote, "A short time ago, the last remaining feather artists lived in Pátzcuaro, once the capital of the kingdom of Michoacán, where this art flourished more than anywhere else after the Conquista. And with him, this precious art has perished, or is about to perish, although it has been more than 2 centuries that it has not been worked with the perfection of the ancients." End of quote. Similarly, Fray Francisco de Ajofrin remarked during his 1763 visit to Pátzcuaro that they, the Indians, have already forgotten this practice. Further complicating the situation, oil painting became the preferred medium from religious images in the 18th century. Despite these challenges, the Michoacán school of feather art continued to attract foreign visitors in the 19th century. Notable visitors include Alexander von Humboldt, who acquired the feather mosaic Madonna on the Crescent Moon in 1803, and likely Carl Wilhelm Koppe, who obtained Saint Joseph with the Child during his tenure as Prussian Consul General in Mexico from 1830 to 32. This mosaic remained in Koppe's possession until he died in 1837, entering the collection of the Royal Prussian Kunstkammer's ethnography department in 1839. Both 18th and 19th century feather art merits thorough research due to its continued and diversified popularity in New Spain in Europe, serving as tokens of American self-identity, manifestations of Mexican cultural distinctiveness, collectibles, and religious objects circulating widely in the Catholic world. Within the network of religious art in Spain, Saint Joseph held a unique status from the onset of Spain's conquest and colonization. Art produced in the colonies often influenced Spanish visual culture and beyond, with the cult of Saint Joseph being a notable example. According to Joseph Chorpening, Saint Joseph's cult took canonical and liturgical forms in New Spain that preceded its evolution in the Old World by several decades. A key resource in evangelizing Mexico and promoting the veneration of Saint Joseph as the guardian of Jesus and Mary was Bernardino de Laredo's Josefina, appended to his ascent to Mount Zion from 1535. For Laredo, Saint Joseph was the greatest saint after the Virgin Mary. His strong positive image and widespread devotion were well established in New Spain long before Saint Teresa of Avila, Laredo's most famous reader, popularized his veneration in Spain. In 1555, Saint Joseph was declared patron of the ecclesiastical province of Mexico during the first Mexican Council, making his feast day a holy day of obligation 66 years before Pope Gregory XV extended this designation to the Universal Church in 1621. He remained in this position until 1746, when the Virgin of Guadalupe was elevated to as his co-patroness. While Mary's universal maternity was well established in the Christian tradition, Saint Joseph's image as a magnanimous protective father, whose patronage extended to all Christians, emerged alongside Spain's colonial enterprise, shaping the paradigm of Spanish colonialism. He was invoked as the special protector of indigenous and African peoples in the New World and was seen as a representative of God and the King in New Spain. Devotion to Saint Joseph was officially expressed through the authorized crowning of his images starting in the 18th century. A prominent feature was the inclusion of a large golden filigree crown akin to those worn by contemporary monarchs. In Mexican art, Saint Joseph's coronation often symbolized allegiance to the Spanish king, with artists frequently combining it with scenes of Joseph's protection of patronage. Other artworks focused on Joseph's protective role while still referencing his coronation. This crowning also highlighted his noble origins in line with the Gospel of Matthew, which traces his Davidic lineage, underscoring his patriarchal, royal, and princely dignity. The rise of Saint Joseph's cult required the invention of new images. Given the saint's popularity in Mexican colonial painting, it is significant that Laredo emphasized how Joseph should be depicted, particularly concerning his age at marriage. Laredo referenced Jean Gerson, who revised the medieval portrayal of Joseph as old and secondary, arguing instead that as head of the Holy Family, Joseph must have been young and robust to protect and support Mary and Jesus. In developing Joseph's imagery, artists drew on existing archetypes, especially those used for virgin and female saints. This repurposing affected gender roles, with the cult of Saint Joseph helping to articulate new ideals of family and virtuous masculinity. Hispanic theologians and artists portrayed Joseph as a nurturing figure, performing tasks such as holding, carrying, caressing, and kissing the Christ child. Carolyn Wilson notes that this affectionate depiction echoes the words of Bernard of Clairvaux, who described Joseph's privileges of intimacies with Christ, I quote, not only to see and hear, but even to carry, lead by hand, hug, kiss, nurture, and safeguard him, end of quote, reminiscent of the Marian iconography known as Eleusa or Mater Amabilis. Similarly, Sandra de Arriba Cantero notes that this nurturing image of Joseph initially arose from a Marianization of his character, which eventually became widely accepted. As depictions of Saint Joseph as a tender father increased, images of the Madonna in her maternal role declined, often replaced by representations of the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. To conclude, and following Alessandra Russo's words, with the Spanish conquest, pre-Hispanic art was transformed forever. But on American land, European art also became something other than itself. The creation of the cult of Saint Joseph and its related imagery exemplifies this transformation. In the Hispanic world, Laredo's theology of Saint Joseph became normative, first in the New World and then in the Old. Although it is challenging to determine whether 18th century feather mosaics were common or exceptional in Mexico, or how widespread their ownership was, the feather painting Saint Joseph with the Child attests to the active role of Novo-Hispanic aesthetics in the iconographic changes significant for the devotion to this saint. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sanya. That was amazing. I mean, what a treat to see those images, because we have one at the V&A. I think that's the only one in this country that I've seen.
The feather.
Yeah. Yes. But gosh, those are amazing, and how interesting in terms of center and periphery.
Yes.
So we can talk about that afterwards.
Yes. The center is in the periphery.
In the periphery, exactly.
So cold.
Yeah, fantastic. So our next speaker again is here. I'm delighted to welcome Sergio Coca. Sergio graduated in history from the Universidad Complutense in Madrid. And since 2022, he's been a member of Spain's Cuerpo Facultativo de Conservadores de Museos Estatales. His research in art and cultural history focuses on the American viceroyalties in the early modern period, particularly on female converts of New Spain, casta painting, and sculpture in the Real Audiencia de Quito. I was introduced to Sergio by the head of the Museo de America, with whom you work, Andrés Gutierrez. I don't know if Andrés is able to join us today. I imagine he's very busy, but we're delighted to welcome Sergio. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you, and sorry for the inconvenience. I will, as I said, speak in Spanish, but I will do my best for speaking slowly. So, primero de todo, tendría que explicar cómo llegué a este tema, y sería porque, como se ve en la imagen, en el Museo de América, cada Navidad, como en otras instituciones culturales en España, se sacan las colecciones de belenes, las colecciones históricas, de las escenas de Navidad con estas esculturas para mostrarlas al público. Algunas se exponen permanentemente, pero en otros casos no. De tal forma que esta época del año se aprovecha justamente para jugar con este valor inmaterial que tiene el Belén o el belenismo, que sería la suma de saberes, de creencias, de tradiciones, de técnicas que permiten fabricar estas figuras, realizarlas, pero también usarlas ceremonialmente o religiosamente en esta época del año, como digo, que es la Navidad. Y en concreto, la colección del Museo de América, porque hasta la fecha apenas había sido estudiada, a pesar de que es uno de los belenes procedentes de Quito, en Ecuador, más importantes o por lo menos también más extensos que existen fuera de Hispanoamérica. Aquí, bueno, habría que explicar realmente qué es el Belén o qué es montar o armar el Belén, que también se llama pesebre o nacimiento, y sería, cito, la representación visual de la Natividad de Jesús en Belén de Judea, mediante figuras móviles que se ubican en un escenario que puede desmontarse. Se realiza en el mes de diciembre para festejar los días 24, Nochebuena, y 25, Navidad, y el 6 de enero, Epifanía o Adoración de los Reyes Magos. Además de la escena principal, se suelen representar otras complementarias. Fin de la cita. Ya he hablado de este valor inmaterial que tendría también el belenismo, los belenes, que serían el testimonio material de esa suma de tradiciones y de saberes, un valor inmaterial que actualmente está muy en boga, puesto que ha sido reconocido en España por el Ministerio de Cultura como manifestación representativa del patrimonio cultural inmaterial. Y también se está promoviendo un reconocimiento análogo por la UNESCO, dado que además esto es una manifestación que comparten otros países, no solamente en Europa, países católicos fundamentalmente, sino también en toda Hispanoamérica. Pero nos vamos a centrar en Ecuador, en Quito. Hay que decir que no me voy a detener mucho en los orígenes, en la difusión de la tradición del Belén, que habría nacido en Europa, concretamente en Italia, en torno al siglo XIII, y de allí se habría ido difundiendo en la Baja Edad Media, sino que me voy a centrar en ese desarrollo en la América virreinal, en los virreinatos americanos, en aquello que Serge Gruzinski llamó la primera globalización de cuño ibérico, incluyendo tanto a España como a Portugal y sus dominios de ultramar, sus dominios en el Nuevo Mundo y en Asia, y también en África. Hay que decir que, como algunos autores han desarrollado, como Pablo Cruz Medina, y cito, la denominación de virreinal tiene todo el sentido, puesto que tal denominación tiende a la denominación, al contrario de colonial, tiende más bien a omitir las dinámicas de circulación y agencia cultural efectuadas dentro del marco de la monarquía hispánica, también llamada la monarquía católica de España, el Imperio Español. Y también el Imperio Luso, evidentemente el Imperio Portugués. En este sentido, hay que centrarse en el protagonismo, la originalidad o la multilateralidad cultural que existió también en estos territorios del Nuevo Mundo. No fueron solamente subordinados del viejo mundo de Europa. Bien, hay que decir que más allá de ciertas influencias iconográficas o doctrinales de los Países Bajos, de Italia, de Nápoles fundamentalmente, el belenismo, la tradición del Belén, se desarrolló en Quito, en América en general, de una forma simultánea y paralela a como lo hizo en España. Tal forma que evidentemente hubo influencias de uno y otro lado, pero no fue una relación totalmente de subordinación. Y así, dentro del marco de la América virreinal, como comenté, de Nueva España, de Perú, de Nueva Granada, lo que ahora sería fundamentalmente Colombia, que también incluyó Quito en el siglo XVIII, vamos a centrarnos en este territorio, la Real Audiencia de Quito, correspondiente a lo que hoy sería Ecuador, porque en este lugar se desarrollaron belenes de una gran belleza, de una gran originalidad, de un gran preciosismo técnico, de los cuales quedan grandes ejemplos en los conventos de Quito, en algunos museos también, y como he dicho, también en Colombia, sobre todo en el Museo Colonial de Santa Fe de Bogotá, que fue capital en su tiempo del territorio que englobó también la Real Audiencia de Quito, lo cual explica que también hubiera belenes conservados allí. Pero vamos a ver también cómo estos belenes llegaron a España. Bien, aquí tenéis una imagen procedente del Museo de América, un cuadro que ya data de la época de las independencias, precisamente un contexto que se ha evocado justo antes, que sería la entrada de las tropas reales en Quito en 1809. Pero permite ver la opulencia, la belleza de este gran centro urbano cuajado de conventos, de iglesias, de palacios, muchos de los cuales albergaron y todavía albergan algunos de estos belenes. Y aquí, aunque esta imagen me vendrá bien para un poquito más adelante, sobre todo por todo este desfile de las tropas del cortejo del virrey, es un virrey arzobispo que entra bajo palio en el extremo derecho, que entra en la ciudad de Potosí, en Perú. Pero, como digo, también nos va a venir bien para hablar luego de, Perú entonces, actual Bolivia, pero que nos va a venir bien luego para evocar algunos aspectos también de la iconografía de los belenes quiteños. Bien, hay que decir que estos belenes se caracterizan por una gran delicadeza técnica, usando materiales no solamente eficaces en la producción, sino también baratos, sobre todo la madera policromada, una madera que se suele llamar de balsa o de barco, para que nos entendamos, por su ligereza. La ligereza de esta madera es muy importante para determinar si esta pieza podría ser quiteña o de otra escuela de escultura virreinal americana, por ejemplo, de Guatemala. Suele ser un rasgo, una pista que nos ayuda mucho, aunque no podemos decir siempre que sea la absoluta para determinarlo. Y luego, como digo, la delicadeza de la policromía, del estofado, con esta aplicación de colores brillantes, de los dorados, que crean todos estos motivos vegetales que nos llevan también a la estética barroca, a la estética del rococó, también por esta influencia italiana, francesa, las pequeñas figuras de porcelana que se estilan en los salones aristocráticos de Europa en este momento. Y también, precisamente hablando de porcelana, la delicadeza de las carnaciones, de la piel, de las anatomías, también de los postizos, que son elementos que se incluyen para dar más realismo, como los ojos de cristal. A veces incluso en otras esculturas encontramos cabello natural, tejidos, corcho para simular, en caso de los Cristos crucificados, las heridas sangrantes, por ejemplo, y son elementos que nos ayudan a dar este mayor realismo, esta mayor cercanía, para que el espectador empatice con lo que está viendo. En este caso sería un sentimiento eminentemente de dulzura y de intimidad familiar con la escena de la Natividad de Jesús. También, como digo, aparte de esta delicadeza material, tenemos que tenemos este elemento antropológico de mostrarnos, también o sociológico, de mostrarnos los trajes típicos de la población de Quito en el siglo XVIII, mostrando sus conductas, sus comportamientos, lo que pueden hacer en las calles, en las plazas, de estas clases populares que son, por así decirlo, invitadas, como en los belenes napolitanos, a presenciar y acercarse al nacimiento de Jesús. Y también un poco este guiño localista de la región de mostrar, por ejemplo, a los dromedarios, a las monturas de los Reyes Magos, una especie de híbrido. A veces parecen más dromedarios o camellos, a veces se parecen un poco más a las llamas o a las alpacas típicas de la región andina, con lo cual lo que intentan es llevar una escena del Nuevo Testamento a la actualidad del 1700, del siglo XVIII. Bueno, hay que decir que antes de entrar en la colección del Museo de América como tal, me pareció importante traer las otras colecciones que existen en España. Son muy pocas. Mi idea es que porque realmente España tuvo una tradición de belenes propia, entonces no se necesitó importar tanto como cuadros de plumaria, por ejemplo, ¿no? Los mosaicos de plumas de los que nos acaban de hablar, enconchados con aplicación de conchas de nácar, etcétera, obras cuya técnica era propiamente americana. En cambio, llegaron algunos como objeto de coleccionismo porque todo lo americano, esa belleza de los reinos de Indias, de los virreinatos, siempre fascinó. Tenemos por un lado que estas colecciones además tampoco han sido nunca ni estudiadas juntas, hasta donde yo sé, ni tampoco se les ha hecho se les ha prestado mucha atención. Entonces voy a hablar brevemente de ellas. Esta es muy importante, el convento del Corpus Christi en Madrid, un convento de exterior muy austero, pero que alberga un Belén con dos conjuntos que para mí yo diría que es el más bello que se conoce fuera de América. Tenemos por un lado la escena de la Natividad, lo que se llama el misterio, la Virgen, San José y el Niño, que durante todo el año se guardan en una sala en la clausura, dentro del convento, no es visible, en esta especie de armario, de escaparate con la puerta de cristal, y el resto de las figuras de los Reyes Magos al pie de esta otra escultura de San Juan Bautista, al lado del claustro. Bien, hay que decir que tienen algunas esculturas muy importantes, como este jinete de la estrella, que es la representación en forma de un ángel que se habría encarnado, según algunos textos de la tradición cristiana, para guiar a los reyes hasta Belén. De tal forma que en vez de la estrella sería un ángel, un jinete, que llevaría esta estrella. Hay que decir también que más allá de la talla en la madera, este tipo de rostros tan delicados también se trabajaban muchas veces de forma estandarizada, casi trabajos en serie, dado la magnitud de la producción de estas figuras y la avidez del coleccionismo, y se hacían con mascarillas de plomo, de tal forma que era mucho más fácil de trabajar y luego se policromaban. Pero también tenemos el heraldo. Como veis, se suele asociar al taller de Manuel Chili Caspicara, que es uno de los grandes escultores de la escuela quiteña de la época virreinal del siglo XVIII, y este heraldo, cuya iconografía, este traje típico del siglo XVIII, nos remite, perdón que vuelvo, un poco a este tipo de uniformes de aquí. tal forma que estamos viendo esta recreación de nuevo de un personaje de la época que asiste al nacimiento de Cristo. Y se le llama el heraldo porque está tocando la trompeta justamente para anunciar este nacimiento. Los Reyes Magos, que son bastante parecidos a los que tenemos en el Museo de América, y detalles de la Virgen y de San José. Antes hemos visto también la ampliación de las telas de las ropas. Bien, es importante también estas figuras dentro del buey y la mula, porque este buey, esta cara, me gustaría que la recordaseis con la lengua fuera y estos ojos, porque lo vamos a ver y nos ayuda a entender los talleres, las relaciones estilísticas con otra colección más adelante. En Antequera, en Málaga, en el sur de España, hay un convento de las Carmelitas Descalzas que conserva otro Belén. Este se limita solo a San José y a la Virgen. Parece que el niño sería napolitano. El Belén se expone todo el año en un museo adyacente al convento, en esta recreación que es importante porque dentro de esta actualización de llevar el nacimiento de Jesús al siglo XVIII, en Quito los decorados son los decorados del centro urbano de Quito, los palacios, los conventos, de tal forma que el palacio del rey Herodes es la fachada del palacio del virrey, por ejemplo. Y aquí, en Antequera, en Málaga, se recrea el centro urbano de la ciudad con la alcazaba, con el castillo musulmán, que sería la fortaleza romana. Y el misterio estaría en este lado de aquí. Aquí sí que se sabe, mientras que en el convento de las Carboneras de Madrid parece que el Belén llegó por coleccionismo de una monja que lo debió donar al convento en el siglo XVIII, no se ha podido ver quién pudo ser, no se ha conservado documentación en este sentido, pero aquí en Antequera sí que lo podemos ligar a un coleccionismo de un funcionario virreinal, un funcionario de la corona que volvió de América y trajo sus colecciones depositándolas muy probablemente en este convento. Y sería don Juan José de Villaluenga, que sirvió en la Real Audiencia de Quito y fue benefactor del convento. Se conserva su retrato, así como el de uno de sus parientes, que fue obispo de Santa Fe de Bogotá. Ya he dicho que estaban relacionados Bogotá y Quito. Y además son interesantes porque es la tipología del cuadro que se puede enrollar, de una tipología asiática denominada kakemono, y esto permite que los cuadros pudiesen viajar más fácilmente, que también es interesante. Y luego tendríamos un Belén del cual yo tengo mis dudas que realmente sea quiteño, pero que se ha registrado siempre como tal en el Museo de la Catedral de Madrid, que procedería de una antigua parroquia de la ciudad que ya no existe. A su vez, allí habría una cofradía que lo habría encargado, pero de nuevo la documentación no permite que veamos más allá. Pero siempre también este coleccionismo ligado a la corte, ligado a la nobleza, a la iglesia, a los conventos. Y en el Museo Nacional de Artes Decorativas tenemos esta pareja que también podría no ser quiteña, yo también tengo ciertas dudas, pero que se documenta como tal y además, si no, nos hablaría de un taller quizás más tardío o más apartado de la capital de Quito, porque vemos que estilísticamente es un poco distinto de los que estamos viendo. Precisamente tenemos estas otras figuras que se datan entre finales del 17, principios del 18, en este mismo museo, y que nos muestran precisamente unos rasgos mucho más parecidos a los que acabamos de ver. Y este sí que sería un misterio completo con la mula y el buey que acabamos de ver. Y luego tienen otras figuras sueltas como este buey de la derecha, que ahora está depositado en el Museo de América y que yo creo que se puede ver bastante bien cómo es muy parecido al que hemos visto en el convento del Corpus Christi de Madrid. Los ojos muy separados y grandes y la lengua que asoma del hocico, ¿no? Que parece que va a lamer, y en este sentido es un gesto bastante anecdótico, bastante gracioso casi, pero que nos ayudaría precisamente a relacionarlo de nuevo con el taller también de Caspícara, como el de las Carboneras. Bien, y llegamos al Museo de América. En este caso hay tres grandes conjuntos. Uno, el más importante, habría sido adquirido como las figuras del Museo de Artes Decorativas en la década de 1950, de un coleccionista privado. Más allá de ahí no hemos podido saber hasta dónde lo adquirió él. Pero esto nos muestra también cómo algunas colecciones que quizás pertenecieron siempre a manos privadas, a una familia, puesto que estos belenes se exponían en los palacios de Quito, pero también en los conventos, han ido pasando de generación en generación hasta llegar al mercado donde el Estado, el Ministerio de Cultura en su día, los pudo adquirir. O bien también pertenecieron a un convento, a una institución religiosa, y tras la desamortización, la nacionalización de los bienes de la Iglesia en el siglo XIX, pasaron a manos privadas. Como digo, estas figuras que se han relacionado con otro taller también de otro gran artista quiteño que sería Bernardo de Legarda, incluirían el misterio y una serie de escenas, puesto que estos belenes no muestran solamente el nacimiento de Cristo y los Reyes Magos, la Epifanía, sino que muestran también la Anunciación, la visitación de María a Santa Isabel, el sueño de San José en el cual le dice que no repudia a la Virgen puesto que está embarazada del fruto del Espíritu Santo, y escenarios posteriores del Nuevo Testamento llegando a la Asunción de la Virgen en cuerpo y alma a los cielos y su coronación. Esto lo veremos ahora. De tal forma que son ciclos teológicamente muy extensos que muestran toda la historia de la salvación cristiana, de tal forma que sea comprensible visualmente para el espectador. Tenemos una serie de ángeles que suelen caracterizarse siempre por estas túnicas ondeantes al viento, con el manto que hace esta especie como de triángulo por detrás, con estas sandalias a la antigua, inspirándose un poco en la tradición, en la tradición de la antigüedad. Y luego tenemos el otro conjunto dentro de esta adquisición de los años 50 de todo el cortejo de los Reyes Magos. Los tenemos aquí delante, creo que aquí tengo un detalle. Se puede ver el parecido con el conjunto de las Carboneras de Madrid. Voy a retroceder un momento, perdón, para que yo creo que el paralelismo es bastante similar, aunque se relacionan uno con Caspicara, otro con Legarda. Estos artistas de nuevo estuvieron muy cercanos también. De tal forma que también hay que hablar de fórmulas iconográficas que son eficaces no solo doctrinal, religiosamente, sino también comercialmente, para ser exportadas y coleccionadas en América, pero también en España. Además, los Reyes Magos se caracterizan siempre por ir a caballo, puesto que el caballo también es un símbolo de estatus, de poder, del cual estaban privados los indígenas según las leyes de India, salvo los nobles, evidentemente, pero no se les representa sobre un camello o un dromedario. Sin embargo, las monturas donde llevan los presentes, los regalos para el niño Jesús, sí que son estas monturas mitad camello, mitad llama, alpaca, a veces es un poco ambiguo, pero también luego destacando los pajes, los portadores que guían las monturas vestidos con chaqueta, con casaca, con tricornio, con camisa, como vestían en el siglo XVIII. Aquí, por ejemplo, también con un mono, un pequeño monito subido, que también es un gesto curioso porque nos muestra lo exótico de América, con especies animales que no se conocen allí. De nuevo, una especie de, parece un ave del paraíso, también un ave endémica del Nuevo Mundo, aunque también de Asia, relacionada con todo este contexto. Y también, de nuevo, bueno, aquí otros animales que podrían ser otras aves exóticas. Pero también hay personajes que se relacionan con los indígenas, con el mundo indígena, como estos dos de la izquierda, con los rasgos, el color de piel, pero también ciertos rasgos que nos muestran que también hay que incluir a los habitantes propios del Nuevo Mundo, de los virreinatos, en esta contemplación. Ellos, al fin y al cabo, el arte también está para evangelizarles y para acercarles a estas doctrinas que no conocen. Este conjunto se ha ido ampliando, por un lado, con un depósito que hubo de 1992 a 2015, que ya no está en el museo, perteneciente a una colección aristocrática del conde de Urquijo, que este depósito se levantó. Y en ese conjunto había una figura del jinete de la estrella, que ya no tenemos. Pero recientemente, en 2023, gracias a la labor de la conservadora Ana Zavía, se encontraron en un anticuario de Madrid estas dos figuras, el ángel parecido a los que hemos visto, y este jinete un poco de menor calidad que, por ejemplo, el de las Carboneras, pero que nos muestra también este tipo de piezas tan icónicas de los belenes quiteños. Son un poco los detalles para ir terminando. Aquí tendrían que ir las alas, se ve que faltan, y también faltaría la vara con la estrella, que sería un postizo, sería una labor que incluso a veces confeccionaban las monjas o sería un postizo de cualquier otro material. Y luego tenemos el último gran conjunto, y con eso termino, un conjunto prácticamente inédito. Yo solo he encontrado una referencia en un artículo de hace ya casi 20 años también, que es relacionado de nuevo con Caspicara, este grupo de la Asunción de la Virgen a los cielos. Como digo, en la narración del Belén llegaba desde la encarnación, la anunciación a la Virgen María, hasta que la Virgen María asciende o es asunta, es elevada a los cielos. Y estas figuras, de las cuales sí que habría otros ejemplos más o menos parecidos en Quito, en España solamente se conoce esta de momento. No es que falte la figura de la Virgen, sino que la Virgen ya está en el cielo. Por eso todas las miradas convergen en torno al sepulcro vacío o hacia los cielos. Esa imagen no estaría, ya estaría en los cielos, como digo. Todas estas actitudes de asombro, de sorpresa, de éxtasis, con estos gestos bellísimos. Y además estas figuras se relacionan con otras de otro conjunto de tamaño mucho mayor que hay en un convento en Quito, en el Carmen Alto, lo cual nos permite relacionarlo con este otro y ver cómo estas transferencias, estas circulaciones de modelos, de iconografías, iban circulando a ambos lados del Atlántico para contribuir a esta riqueza del arte virreinal americano. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Sergio. That was wonderful. It's so lovely to be able to see those images close up.
Now it is on display, and I think it's the first time in the history of the museum when we can contemplate these figures, because they were always in the
store.
In the store, yeah.
Yeah, great.
So I invite you to come to the Museum of America,
Fantastic.
so you can see.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think this is our last one before we have the discussion, so bear with us. Now we go to our speakers from abroad. Our first speaker is Dr. Helena Robin. Helena is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Visual Arts at Western University in Canada. She specializes in religious art of colonial Mexico, specifically the representation of the Passion of Christ, but she's also interested in the historiography of painting in New Spain, conservation, restoration of cultural heritage, and the presence of Latin American art in Canada. And she's going to actually talk about an exhibition in Canada today, which is a little bit of a different kind of talk. So really looking forward to it. Thank you, Helena.
Thank you so much. I would like to start by thanking the organizer of this incredible panel. I'm amazed so far by everything I've been hearing, and my apologies for not being able to be there in person today. So I'm going to take you to different lands, but that are somehow connected. So I'm speaking from Canada, but yeah, eventually we'll get to Latin American Viceregal art. The year 1967 marked a special celebration for Canada. Throughout the country, different events marked the first centennial of the Confederation. In particular, the city of Montreal was the host of the international fair called Expo 67, Terre des Hommes, Man and His World. With pavilions of some 60 nations around the globe, Expo 67 provided Montreal the opportunity to show itself as a city open to the world. In this context, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts organized a temporary exhibit entitled The Painter and the New World that ran during the summer for less than 2 months. Displaying a survey of painting ranging from 1564 to 1867, year of the Canadian Confederation, David Carter, director of the museum and curator of the exhibit, offered a selection of artworks coming from or connected to the topics of seas, lands, people, and ideas from Canada, the United States, and many countries of Latin America. As a specialist of Viceregal art, a few years ago, I was studying the small Lionel Roy collection of colonial Mexican paintings and sculpture in the Musée de la Civilisation in Quebec City. In the files, I discovered that 3 paintings had traveled to Montreal for the 1967 exhibition. This triggered my curiosity. I was not sure how colonial art from Latin America was connected to the Canadian Confederation, and this question prompted a visit to the archives of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. At the moment when the disciplines of art history and museum studies are struggling to decolonize their content, exhibitions such as this one are somehow problematic to revisit, since this one in specific, is embedded in a colonial discourse celebrating the settlement of external nation over others and celebrating the grandiose lands they conquered in America. It is, however, revealing of the geopolitics of the time, so it's 1967, and how the visual arts were a tool to activate the relations between nations. In particular, the Canadian context is interesting as a former British colony and its proximity to the US. This presentation considered the specific circumstances in which the exhibit was conceived and how the director made initial contacts with museum and collectors and other cultural institutions, establishing cultural and diplomatic relations to include artworks from the former Spanish-American colonies and Brazil, along Canadian and US paintings. The focus will be on the communications established to secure the loans, on the artworks chosen, and on the reception by the audience who visited the exhibition. This presentation is based on a close reading of the exhibition catalog, first-hand documents from the museum archives, mostly letters, telegrams, handwritten notes, and the press coverage of the moment. David Carter was the director of the museum at that time and also curator of the exhibition. He graduated with a BA in Art and Archaeology from Princeton in 1944, and after working as a courier with the Department of State during the Second World War, Carter earned a master's degree from Harvard University in 1949. He then specialized for 2 years at the Fine Art Institute of New York prior to becoming assistant curator of painting in 1952 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. In 1955, he left that position to become curator of painting and engraving at the John Arendt Art Institute of Indianapolis, where he also taught art history. From 1959, Carter was director of the Rhode Island School of Design Museum of Art. He was then appointed director of the Montreal Museum of Fine Art in April 1964, so coming to Canada, remaining in that position until 1976. Although Carter seemed to have developed a profound knowledge of medieval art, specifically from Northern Europe, he was also recognized as an authority in the field of Spanish art due to an exhibition that was held while he was at the John Arendt Art Institute, entitled Spanish Master from El Greco to Goya. Carter must have been exposed to the field of Latin American colonial art in the United States prior to coming to Canada. Indeed, in the 1960s, the United States had a continued interest in Latin American art for quite some time. Not only modern art, but also pre-Columbian and colonial art through temporary exhibition and acquisition policies of different museums. The U.S. interest in Latin American art was guided by the Good Neighbor policy and Cold War geopolitics, increasing concerns over hemispheric security. Carter's geography of the 1967 Montreal exhibit refers to, and I'm going to use keywords from the documents and the catalog, artists in the New Worlds, the Americas, in plural, Hispanic America, the Spanish dominions, and then also referring to viceroyalties of Peru, Nueva Granada, Nueva España, New France, which would be the province of Quebec today in Canada, New England, and specific towns or regions. Carter sometimes refers to South America, usually when he wanted to encompass Brazil. Carter did not employ the term Latin America, but I do use it, although I know it has some problems, but I use it as an umbrella term for the area. The Montreal audience had previously been exposed to some Latin American exhibition at the museum, but mostly of contemporary art in the 1940s and pre-Columbian art in the 1950s. There were in the 1960s some incipient collection of Latin American art in Canadian museums. In particular, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts was fruitful in collecting pre-Columbian art. Securing the loans for the exhibition was not an easy task, and the result is not representative of the efforts invested by David Carter and his teams. Some cultural diplomacy contacts were established by the curatorial team of the museum, since the communication were initiated through the Canadian embassies in Latin American countries. The correspondence seemed to suggest that the museum appeared enthusiastic by the initial contacts, but the request did not necessarily materialize in loans for the exhibition. Private collectors from Latin America seemed more willing to lend works from their collection than the governmental museums. Cultural institutions in Latin America seemed at first quite receptive to Carter's request. For example, Jorge Hernández Campos from the Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes in Mexico answered that his institution was looking forward to establishing a closer link with Canada, mentioning a desire to host an exhibition representative of contemporary Canadian painters using the selection made every year for the Sao Paulo Bienal. In Peru, Carter was in contact with Francisco Stasny, the director of Museo de Arte in Lima. In the letter to Carter, Stasny said that the museum in Lima was extremely interested in receiving the catalog of the exhibition, The Painter and the New World, as well as the general catalog of the Montreal Museum. Stasny even goes on to say, and I quote, "Perhaps we could establish an exchange system for all publications." In Venezuela, many contacts were made, but were not successful as no loans were secured. In particular, Carter was interested in a portrait of the independence figure Simón Bolívar. It also turned out to be extremely complicated to find some works by Brazilian artists. For Mexico, Carter followed the advice of the president of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, Mr. Murray Vaughan, who resided part of the year in Cuernavaca, and hence had a connection with the artistic scene in Mexico. He recommended contacting gallerist Inés Amor so she could handle the Mexican loans. Carter's request to Inés Amor came late, as the letters are dated from February and March 1967, and the show opened in June. Inés Amor is an iconic figure in Mexican modern art since she founded the first art gallery, Galería de Arte Moderno, in Mexico City in 1935. Through her initiatives, the gallery promoted the career of young artists beyond the support of the Mexican government, providing them with an opportunity to sell their work on the national and the international scenes. The Montreal Museum specifically requested that her gallery be the central collecting point where the works to be borrowed from Mexico would be properly packed under her supervision, exported to Montreal, and then returned to their particular owners using the gallery premises. Initial contact had already been made with the Mexican governmental cultural authorities, and the Canadian embassy was also involved at some point. But Inés Amor's involvement was crucial. Private collectors in Mexico agreed to have her manage the shipping of their collection, giving her a esteemed reputation in the art world, such as a feather mosaic on loan from Franz Mayer in Mexico City. Securing the loans from Mexico went fairly smoothly, thanks in part to previous contact established by the Montreal Museum and key figure Inés Amor. However, there were relatively few artworks coming directly from Latin American public collection on loans for the Montreal exhibit. And here I have two exceptions coming from the Museo Histórico and Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Buenos Aires. From the museum's archive correspondent, it seems that contact with South American countries such as Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela were much more complicated. Many communication went through the Canadian embassies and not Carter directly in correspondence with the museum. Most of the requests for loans were declined, so these are exceptions that we can see on the screen for different reasons. Maybe this is an indicator that the relation between Canada and the Southern Hemisphere were not that strong at that moment, or at least not on the cultural scene. A managing figure such as Inés Amor for Mexico was undeniably lacking. In fact, most of the colonial Latin American paintings came from the United States from such museums as the Brooklyn Museum, Philadelphia Museum of Art, and Davenport Art Gallery. These are museums in the United States that have long-standing collection of Latin American art. Many reasons can explain this selection. In the 1960s, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts would already have an established network of firm contacts in the United States and Europe. Carter, due to his education and previous employment, was also well connected with museum and collector in the United States. Museum in Canada did not have a wide collection of colonial Latin American art, yet those collections were also taken into consideration for the selection of artworks for the painter in the New World. One painting came from the Montreal Museum of Fine Art, a small collection of colonial art that we can see on the left, and on the right is one of the three paintings from the Lionel Roy collection housed in the Musée du Séminaire in Quebec City. This is a clear indicator that although obscure today, these collections were known and appreciated in the 1960s. While colonial Hispanic America ends from when the former colonies became sovereign nations in the 1820s, the end year of Carter's survey of colonial painting in 1867 is aligned with Canadian history in the nation confederation when it became somehow independent from Great Britain. This unusual periodization would allow for the inclusion of international artists traveling and depicting the young independent nations, which is not a traditional way of addressing the periodization of the New World south of the US border. This fact did not seem to raise concern from the curatorial team in Montreal, as they view these lands align in their desire, and I quote, of independence and maturity. The exhibition presented a double path. The first is a visual account of the development of the New World, and the second is the development of the art of painting in that world. The display offered a selection of painting, watercolors, and drawing that included artists and images from Canada, the United States, different nations from the former Spanish colonies, and Brazil. However, out of the 359 artworks, less than a fourth were related to countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Peru. Most of the artworks from colonial Mexico were easel paintings. Many works were anonymous, while some were by celebrated painters such as Baltasar de Chavarrioja, that we can see on the screen, Cristobal de Villalpando, Nicolás Rodríguez Juárez, Miguel Cabrera, José de Páez, all of them still recognized today as pillars of the new Spanish school of painting. Most illustrated religious topics, but there was also an important selection of portraits.
We have an echo.
I'm not sure why. I can also hear it.
Yeah.
Maybe, Nicola, you can silence yourself and only Helena has a mic.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Most illustrated religious topics, but there was also an important selection of portraits. There was a higher proportion of artworks coming from colonial Mexico than the rest of colonial Latin America. The other section related to Latin America in the exhibit was represented by traveling artists who were from either Europe or the United States, but spent a considerable amount of time in the Americas in the 19th century, where the countries were independent nations. Those artists represented the grandiose architecture, countryside, and the ethnographical views of different nations, scenes that could be appealing to an international audience, such as the one in Montreal, not necessarily familiar with these lands. This section included, for example, a view of Mexico City Main Square by Pietro Antonio Gualdi, as we can see on the right on the screen, who was born in Italy but traveled to Mexico City in 1835 and remained in the country until 1851. A similar case is provided with German artist Johann Moritz Rugendas, who is recognized for his depiction of landscape and ethnographical representation in several countries of Latin America in the first half of the 19th century. From Austrian painter Thomas Ender, there was 7 small watercolors views of Rio de Janeiro that he made while traveling in Brazil in 1817. 2 artworks of American landscape painter Frederick Edwin Church also portrayed the landscape of South America. Among other artists from Church that depicted landscape from other parts of the Americas, such as an iceberg from Newfoundland. It is hard to address the legacy of such a wide-ranging art display. Many stakeholders in the planning of the exhibition were aware from an early stage that the Painter in the New World was an ambitious project. One of the issues that Carter faced while making his selection of works was to show the breadth of colonial Latin American painting. Furthermore, some of the artworks he was interested in borrowing were already premised for concurrent exhibitions. Others were in too delicate state of conservation to travel abroad. From the museum archive, it is clear that he was well aware of the limitation of its selection. Additionally, the Painter in the New World installation was somehow shadowed by the fascination with Expo 67. Both events took place in completely different areas of the city. The museum is located in the downtown core, while the fair was held on St. Helena Island in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, accessible by the then newly inaugurated subway system. The World Fair received much more visibility, which is important to factor in when looking at the disappointing number of visitors of the exhibition at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. The exact number were not found, but the low turnout is part of the concerns Carter shared in his correspondence. The exhibition did not travel to other museums, but the catalog raised much interest in the United States. John Kennedy, a journalist from the New York Times, did not make it on time to the exhibition due to the lack of publicity in the United States. He, however, published a note based on the catalog, and I quote, "It could hardly have been anything but a great exhibition by the evidence of the catalog, a big book. Reproduce large and clear the paintings of the display." After the publication of his note, many requests came in from the United States to obtain a copy of the catalog. Furthermore, when the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts sent a copy of the catalog to the lenders, many expressed a desire to acquire at their own cost more copies to circulate in their circle. Although he did not get to see the exhibition, John Kennedy, again in the New York Times, highly esteemed the proposition, and I quote, "The Canadians have now given us the way to arrange a thematic exhibition." Other notes in other newspapers referred to it as having the potential, and I quote, "a unifying theme in the history of the Americas." Another one talked about the exhibition as a knockout, and that he knew, and I quote, "nothing else that covers the Spanish element so well." The most poignant comment came from Alfred Frankenstein, a specialist of American painting and art critic at the San Francisco Chronicle, who was teaching 2 courses in the history of American painting over the summer at Harvard University. He missed the exhibition in Montreal, which was, in his world, the greatest American show in all of human history and the greatest disappointment of his professional career. In fact, he says, "I would call it a major tragedy." He eventually ended up publishing a note in the San Francisco Chronicle where he highly praised the exhibition through the catalog, because he never saw the exhibit. And this is a long quote, so bear with me. He says, "The Painter in the New World did not limit itself to painting in Canada, and there lies its unique importance. It was the first exhibition ever organized to cover painting in all the Americas, North, South, and Middle. The book Artistic Revelation cannot be taken seriously enough. Most of us know nothing at all about the history of painting in Canada and very little about the history of painting in Latin America." End of his quote. So from these different notes, what we can perceive is that the reception of the exhibition was done morely through the catalog and not the art display per se. More than half a century after the exhibition was held, its legacy in relation to Latin American colonial art is not that obvious. It did not change the perception of the Canadian audience toward that heritage. However, the Montreal Museum of Fine Art is today the cultural institution in Canada that is the most actively involved in acquiring and exhibiting Latin American art. Throughout this directorship, Carter is credited to having improved the relationships between major American museum institutions and the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. The exhibition, The Painter in the New World, is an example of the many connections he and his team established as cultural diplomacy during the Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. That was wonderful. Seems like such a long time ago. So we now have nearly half an hour for the discussion. Does anybody in the room have a question? Okay, Jeremy.
Helena, I thought your talk was absolutely fascinating. One question I had for you really is about style rather than iconography, because it struck me that silver statuette would seem to be so much sort of out of its time. It kind of seems. Is it based on your times or what?
Well, there is a silversmith school of Cusco, and it roughly follows the style of the silversmith school of Cusco. But I haven't done an in-depth stylistic study of the sculpture. It's not what I focused on, but it does follow the roughly the Cusco school of silversmith of silver practice. Yeah.
So this is typical of.
Yes, it does follow the 19th century prototypes.
And it's not a deliberate kind of retarded there.
I don't know. I don't know enough to answer exactly whether it's a deliberate choice, but I wouldn't, my instinct wouldn't say it wouldn't be that it's a deliberate choice.
Thank you. And I felt actually similar thing about the feather pictures. And particularly, I thought extraordinary was the Virgin of Guadalupe, which always reminds me of Cortauld's manuscripts. And it's so retro with the figure holding up the universe blossom.
Yes, and
it can't straight out of carriage and not you know what I mean?
yes,
The iconography is very much.
yes,
Early medieval.
yes.
Can I just add something
Yes,
else?
sure.
I believe maybe it might be generally the 19th century style. We can talk about style in Hispano-America and in the Iberian Peninsula is completely different, and we tend to identify Viceregal art as a bit more rigid and retro, you said, but I think it just might be the idea that we have of it, and it's not necessarily something that we can link to an intention of making it seem older. I just think it's a style that developed naturally there. I don't think it's linked to making it look earlier or medieval or
Yeah, I think we shouldn't forget that also on the American soil, the earth goddesses, the female earth goddesses reflected also in the images of female saints and the Virgin also, and that the moon there is very important as the pre-Hispanic goddesses were related frequently with the moon. So maybe because that intensity, because she's standing on the moon crescent, has to do a lot with pre-Hispanic religion.
Was it partly just the artists weren't academically trained, so they weren't actually, unlike what's going on in Europe, where looking at classical motifs and goodness knows what. Therefore, they did have a slightly more stocky style. I agree. It looks sort of slightly. You wouldn't say it's 19th century European because it's very different from what's going on in Europe. It does seem to be that, but because of the people that were making it.
I could add that for the Our Lady of Guadalupe, sorry, for the Virgin of Guadalupe, there was also the link with the iconography of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin with the moon, with the crescent of the moon. So there are so many models. For example, in 50th, 60th century in Spain, we have a painter called Juan de Juanes, who was painting the Virgin Mary with a model which was so similar to the Our Lady of Guadalupe. So,
and that modeling, when you look back at the origins of the Immaculada iconography, it's really complex, and it does go back to the medieval period. I mean, it took quite a long time. We looked at this, Abia, in our course on Seville. You know, it took quite a long time for the iconography of the Immaculate Conception to sort of coalesce into one iconography, didn't it? Because, you know, there was no iconography until Juan de Juanes. There were all sorts of different things which came together, and then with the counter-reform, you know, there's a movement to try and fix it, and you have people like Pacheco in his Arte de la Pintura, who writes at length and gives a very detailed description. So you're just going to have to listen to me. Okay, I'm here. Who gives a very detailed description of the correct iconography, because he is the Spanish Inquisition's iconographer, and he's also Velázquez's father-in-law, as you probably know. But he gives a very detailed description in the last part of his book of a number of iconographies, one of which is the Immaculate Conception. And so it's a very interesting iconography, and then it becomes a big thing in Seville in the 17th century, because many people are very devoted to the Immaculate Conception. So it's a very complicated iconography, but it's very interesting that it was picked up on in the New World as part of the Virgen de Guadalupe, you know, because it's not, the Virgen de Guadalupe in Spain doesn't have that immaculate iconography as part of it, does it? I don't think. Yeah. I mean, that was going to take me to another you know, link between the papers was, you know, the way that the iconography of St. Joseph gets picked up is very strange.
Yes.
Because St. Joseph we don't really see very much of St. Joseph, do we? Irene, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to ask, not knowing much about this, can you say a bit more about why St. Joseph's thinking about center and periphery? Why did it take off in the periphery? Was that the result of European missionaries promoting the cult, or was there something appealing to indigenous people?
I just say that Irene is the main editor of Colnaghi Studies journals. Irene.
Right. Yes, the missionaries actually took a lot of St. Joseph's cult with themselves, and when they came to Mexico Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City today, they constructed the first church and school dedicated to San Jose, St. Joseph. So it was the first church in the Americas in general, and one of the first in the world, like one of the first 3 in the world dedicated to St. Joseph. And from the beginning of the conquest, and especially with Friar Pedro del Gantes instructions, they started to build in the figure of St. Joseph as like the most important saint in the New World, and it is especially the natives and the Africans that were brought with them were devoted to St. Joseph.
Was that political motivated? I mean, was that a sort of feeling that a patriarchal?
It might be. I have read a lot of things about St. Joseph, why that, and it appears that the French missionaries also had that idea, and when there was a struggle within the Catholic Church with among popes, so this Jean Gerson would say that they should look at like St. Joseph and behave like that. And also like as a perfect father figure who is like there always to support. And then we start with the age of St. Joseph, and then his role in the New World completely changes as this supportive father, because if we see the European iconography from the time, he's always in the background, so he's never a protagonist, And here, like the main saint, as we see in Mexico, he was the principal saint until mid-18th century when the Virgen de Guadalupe comes as his patroness. So, yes, sure.
Disagree with that, because actually St. Joseph was very important in Spain. That was actually quite an important book.
Yes, more in Spain than anywhere else, and that's why they took it to the New World.
So sorry,
Yes.
I misunderstood you.
Yeah.
Especially sculptures.
Yeah, he was important, but then some different things happens on the new soil of the New World.
Right.
So it starts to become even more prominent. And the theme of coronation, also we have the coronation. Jesus coronates the Saint Joseph in Zurbarán's painting in the 16th century, but it's not that big filigree crown. It's a wreath of flowers. And that's the only one.
Yes.
And then in the 18th century, these big crowns start to be like very prominent.
Polly, maybe you should introduce yourself. Will you introduce yourself when you speak?
Oh, sorry, yeah, I'm untrusted. I had a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
But I don't want to interrupt the flow of the discussion. One was going back to the silver statuette. Again, like Jeremy, really enjoyed your talk. I just wondered if you could imagine, or if there's any physical evidence of what its function was. Do we know it was on top of something, or do we know anything?
So unfortunately, the museum is not very interested looking at the statuette, which is something I'm very sad about, because I really enjoy and I really care about examining the pieces up close. I couldn't see the piece from the bottom, so I don't know how the base is exactly made. I think it was private devotion, destined for private home, but I'm thinking it was just like inside a kind of a tabernacle, but there are no
Part of the bigger.
I don't think it was part of a bigger ensemble, no. But unfortunately, I'm trying to have the museum let me take it off the pedestal and have a look at it. But yeah, it's a pity. I'm thinking it was a private home, on top of a pedestal, but not part of something bigger. I don't know if you've seen something bigger, an ensemble, if you have any example that could be compared.
No, I just, it looked as if it might have had a context, really. At the moment, it's a bit isolated, but who knows? I had two other very quick questions. Sorry, I hope very quick. Anna Maria, who is working very, very interesting paper. I think somebody mentioned that, that it was the portrait of the artist, Montero, oil on porcelain.
Yeah, and very little, it's very small.
Not to come across that. It's not fired, but just paint porcelain and then oil. It's amazing.
Yeah, this is a mystery also because we don't know nothing about this painter. And now the museum, they had this nice exhibition, and they were able to, they took this from the frame, and they saw this painting is in the 1890s, and Firmino of Monteiro was already dead, because at first we thought she was a disciple of him, maybe because he was also a teacher, but now we don't know. Maybe she was, and then she did this homage for him after his death. We don't know. He died exactly the same year of the abolition of slavery in Brazil, and he was preparing a painting about the event, but he didn't finish. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Very quick. I don't have to take swallow the discussion. The feathers, again, lovely paper on feathers that you suggest, etc. Do feathers change colour in the light? Because in fact, I've seen a few feather pictures. They're incredible colours. Are they just kept safely, or it's just?
Yes, they're very sensitive to light. Yeah,
and they retain them by chance because people that looked after them are supposed to expose them to the sunlight.
Yeah, they're very sensitive,
Right.
and especially the iridescence comes from hummingbirds
Yeah.
and the quetzal bird. So that not all the feathers do have that refracting light if we change them. And the feather painters, as they are called, or artists, they choose the part of the feather that best fits for the desired effect they want. So they cut them precisely. So if the feather is like this or this big, they will just cut a small part and then do the mosaic. Then you can have one feather, and then by cutting it, you can create different kind of effects just from one same bird. Or the last, I think, slide was the guacamaya, the bird, which has these like nice blue, yellow, and red feathers, so you can combine them. But the refraction comes quetzal and hummingbirds, so they're very, very small.
But they don't change. No, I know about the butterflies. They don't change. They can be catched in the 19th century. They still have the same colors. I think it's the same thing for the feathers.
Yeah, you have to.
They don't change.
You move or you move the thing.
But it's not like a painting that can lose the color.
Yes, you keep them out of the light.
Physical thing.
Yes.
It's not
Yes.
chemical,
Yes.
something like this.
Yes, it's the refraction of light by moving, and then it comes like second by second passing, and then you have this like illumination, like movement in time.
The conservation is very delicate,
Yes.
and I really appreciate the fact that you stress the point of the kinetic virtue of these paintings, of these mosaics, because they were conceived and realized for being on display on churches, on palaces, which were illuminated by candles. So
Like
this
the
was
flickering of light.
an art in movement. So it was absolute. Now we can only put on display for a little bit of time, and we have very low light.
You have to get it out of the drawer to see it.
We have to imagine it in the altar pieces of of churches or oratories or little chapels, because the effect was.
In pre-Hispanic times, the painting format, this quadrangular format, was not existing. So that is completely like something that comes with the Europeans. They have different objects. And I mentioned that the church ecclesiasticals did not only admire them or kept them as in a museum, they also used them in liturgies, such is the case of the Federico Borromeo, whose uncle was Pope Pius IV and gave him a Mexican meter. So this one would do the service with that meter on. So in Italian museums, there are a lot of feather work. Yes.
Yeah.
Like 2 meters long.
That's amazing, because we only, I think there's only one in this country, unless there's some in private collection.
There's one at this society as well, isn't there?
In New York. Yeah. But I think it's really interesting to draw a connection between your two papers, and I want to ask another question to Anna. But both of you spoke about works of art. I mean, in the case of the Belenes, as you said, there weren't many that came to Spain because there was a tradition in Spain of producing them. And so, was it that the people wanted something exotic, or, as opposed to, the featherwork, which was exotic and people did want to bring it over, but it also maybe had this spiritual connection as well somehow through the feathers. I don't know if they were using it for a mitre. I mean, I'm also thinking of the comparison with Enconchados, those wonderful pieces that Colnaghi sold several of. I remember when I was here, which are to do with shell work, which again come to Spain and also to America. Oh, do you? Yeah. But in Museo de America recently had an exhibition about Enconchados, and so there were many of those that came to Spain, but interesting, not many Belenes.
Well, we could think that there was an exotic collectionism, but on the other side, we have to think that there were manufactured for the local clients, the convents, the aristocrats, the royal servants, royal public servants. So, on the other hand, the sculptures of Ito were very prized in Spain. For example, there is the works attributed to Charles III of Spain in the 18th century. Some scholars think that these works are apocryphal, but if si non è vero ben trovato, like Italian says. So he said, in my kingdoms, I don't need a Michelangelo, because I have a Manuel Chili Caspicaro.
Yeah.
So it's the importance of these sculptures, these workshops, these artists, which were very prized in Spain. Mm-hmm.
Well, I have heard, sorry, I've heard this and I may be wrong. To a point, Nicola, about why they bought works. I have heard that in Spain, with the rise of neoclassicism, with the rise of a sort of reaction against colour and folk art, as they might call it, the only places they could get that kind of style again is from South America. Certainly in the 19th century, it really did happen. I don't know about the 18th century.
Did they still produce them in Naples at that point? Presumably they did. Presumably they did. Yeah. I'd like to ask Alina a question, and then I want to ask Anna a question. Alina, thank you so much for that really fascinating talk. I mean, can you hear me, Alina?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Now, I was really interested to know were there exhibitions like this there was nothing like this in North America before, right? You said this was the first exhibition of this kind, or was there one in United States of America?
According to the journalist, it was the first of its kind. There were other kind of exhibition, including Latin American art, but they were focusing on Latin America, not opening a dialogue with US painters or Canadians. So this, according to that journalist, it was the first of its kind. But from my work in the files of the archives of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, the first exhibit, including Latin American art, was from the 1940s, and it included a collection from the IBM company. And this one had one example of each of the Canadian provinces, but also they tried to have one example from each of the countries of Latin America. So it was similar, but much similar in its geography, but much smaller in its scope, because it didn't have like 300 paintings. It was more reduced.
I think what interested me then was, what was it about? I mean, I know that David Carter was American.
Yes.
But did he pick up on a feeling in Canada that Canada wanted to be related to other countries that had a more strong colonial past? I mean, I know United States of America also had one, but it's also, the big imperialist power, whereas Canada at the time presumably sympathized a bit more with countries outside of America, because it was not quite such a big, imperial or imperialist power.
Yes, part of it is part of this cultural diplomacy that was taking place. But it's interesting because Canada was very late in having some embassies. For example, in South America, I think it's only, for example, in Brazil, I think it's the 1940s. So it's still a recent phenomenon. And like the Montreal Museum of Fine Art is a very wide collection. They have a strong European collection, but also Canadian, obviously. And for some reason, they had some connection with donors of pre-Columbian art. So it was, I think Carter was trying to pick up on his own training in European painting and trying to make something relevant for 1967 ambiance of connecting Canada and the world, and also celebrating the federation. So it's a complex message she was trying to send, and obviously now we see it from a decolonial perspective, and yeah, there is a lot of troubled waters, I would say.
Yeah.
And there's levels of readings that could be done of the exhibit.
Are there any other questions for
her? Yeah.
Yes, okay. Because I have a question for you, but I'll ask it afterwards.
Helena.
Yes.
Helena, I have a question. It's about, because you said it was difficult for them to contact Brazil, something like this. So I was wondering if it was about the political situation, because we were under a doctorship. That's it or not? Can you explain?
No, I think it was the complexity of pinpointing specific like works that could travel. And museum maybe not being so eager to connect with the nation like so far away. And it was easier for Carter to connect with museum in Europe that had some works that were related to Brazil. So the political context is not alluded directly. Maybe it's an indirect relation. But it was not, it's not the first reading I had, no.
Okay, thank you.
But it's still the same problem. I mean, I think there's still such a divide between, is Latin America not the right term? Latin America and Brazil. And I mean, I find it, we run Athena Art Foundation and we try and list exhibitions around the world, but there is very little information that we have access to here of what's going on. So I still think there is the Atlantic, the South Atlantic, there's a big divide. Anyway. Did you? Oh, Richard. Introduce yourself.
Richard Yates, and I'm a historist working at Durham University. I have a question which was inspired by Hannah's presentation, but it's a question for the other three panelists in the room. The artists who create the Bellinists and the people creating the feather mosaics, do we know anything about their ethnic or social standing as artists? What part of the Viceregal society do they come from? And is there any intelligence about the degree to which they were indigenous artists or were themselves colonial artists transplanted to Latin America?
For the 16th century, from the so-called contact period, we know that they were indigenous, like for sure, because there are a lot of sources, as for instance, the Florentine Codex I mentioned, but this is not the only source. And especially the book 9 speaks of feather artists entirely. So we know a lot about them from there. But then in 1530s, Friar Vasco de Quiroga makes his own atelier in Michoacán that I mentioned with these Purépecha artists. So they could come from pretty much any echelon of the society if they were good for that. For the Maya, pre-Hispanic Maya, they were only like high-class artists. Only them could enter. But for the central Mexico and northern part of Mexico, if they were good at it, they could be anybody. But it's different from the 16th century and then 17th and then 18th, and then it declines. Though we still have this small devotional feather artworks, but it's not that prominent as it used to be in the past. But my guess is that Catholic friars would pick up the children of probably more prominent, so to speak, people, and then teach them in Latin and arts, and then they would bring their own knowledge on everything. And then as time goes on, we don't have indigenous or European, we have the thing that we call Neo-Hispanic, which is something else, a new genre, which combines two things, which give us something different, something unique.
And as for painters or sculptors, sculptures. We have also a huge presence of indigenous artists, both in Mexico or in Peru or even Ecuador, because in Quito, in the Museo de América, we have a painting, a triple portrait of three mulatto. The term is not very correct nowadays, but it was the term used at the time. Three mulatto leaders of the indigenous people of that region. So, and the paint and this portrait was executed by a indigenous artist, Andrés Sánchez Galque, and the Galque part is the key for understanding his origin. In Mexico as well, we have painters. I think you have show us some of them. José de Páez and José de Ibarra. Some of them, Juan Correa. There were mestizos. Mixed race, or so with a part of indigenous origin, they were also Afro-American. We could say that today. For example, the museum has just acquired a painting of Tomás de Sosa. It was a mulatto painter who signed in the texts of his time, such as the Brotherhood painters, for example,
Yes.
El Gremio. As the guild, thank you very much, as a mulatto, a free mulatto. So even they were even proud of that origin. So,
If I may add something, the Florentine Codex, which is 3 volumes kept in the Florentine Library in Florence, in Italy. So it has been attributed as Fray Bernardino de Sahagún as the author or supervisor. Nowadays, we include the names of other people who participated, which were Nawa speaking, the language of the Aztecs. And then we now say Sahagún and this and that. So it's really a list of names because they were not present before. It's really a new thing now that we include, and they were indigenous, and especially all the images that exist in the Florentine Codex were done by the indigenous artists, who really quickly, like in a real-time velocity, adapted to new forms, and whatever the Europeans, the Spanish predominantly asked, they were quick to adopt. As to the format
as well.
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you very quickly, because I think we should take a break and have some tea. I think everybody's pretty gasping, but he was I mean, you say he died the year that slavery was abolished in Brazil. So but was there an enslaved were there enslaved patrons for his work, or do you think his work was all for European patrons?
It's difficult to explain because it was a very complex situation. We know there are people there who they had slaves, and they were, for example, they signed something saying, when I die, all my ex-slaves, they will be free.
Yeah.
But it was in a time of there are a lot of movement for the abolition.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the white people were for abolition, but we say that the emperor of Brazil, it's the change of the political system from an empire for a republic is a consequence of the abolition.
Yeah.
Because after the abolition, the great owners of the farms, coffee farms, the plantations, they were not happy with this, and they began the movement. Well, it's very complex. But there were a lot of black people free.
So they might have.
He was born free.
He was born free.
Yeah. So we cannot imagine this. Another word.
Quick thing, because I think we got a break.
I have a question for Sergio. I was wondering when you mentioned that there was all this process of like bringing to the time and space in which the pavilion was created, the scene of the birth of Christ. In, for example, the fact that the palace of Herodes was a palace of the Virrey. Do you think there's an intention of drawing a parallel in some way between Herodes and the Virrey in some symbolic way of like describing them as like drawing a parallel between the two characters?
We could think, even we would want to think, there was a political or ideological link between this parallelism, but I think it was most of a link between the political power of the biblical time and the 18th century in Quito. I think it's just that because on the other hand, you have the place where Christ was born, where the Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph, the animals, the shepherds, everything. It was it recreated the facades of churches or palaces in Quito. So there were for bringing that story back to their time.
Okay, I think we've got a break.